I don't know whether it's a coincidence or pre-planning, but this happens to be a very appropriate moment for a discussion of El Salvador and U.S. grand strategy. As most of you know, yesterday was the anniversary of the execution of 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests, in 1989. Their housekeeper and her daughter murdered by an elite U.S. trained and armed battalion, a brigade which had already compiled a bloody record of atrocities, killing nobody knows how many people, the usual victims, peasants, working people, union leaders, human rights activists, and so on. When that was the end, that sort of framed that and the 25th anniversary that was just mentioned, the assassination of the Archbishop in 1980 and the 4 American church women just 25 years ago, frames the hideous decade of the 1980s in El Salvador and in fact in the whole region of Central America. It's worth bearing in mind that all of this passes unremembered, unmentioned. You didn't see anything about it in the papers yesterday, nor it's all in the memory hole. Just imagine that something like that had happened, say, in one of the Soviet satellites, let's say Czechoslovakia. So suppose yesterday was the anniversary of the execution of Václav Havel and half a dozen of his associates, and now it's the 25th anniversary of the murder of an archbishop, voice for the voiceless, reading mass, and in between, Soviet-trained troops had killed roughly 70,000 people. Would it be known? Well, possible, but it wouldn't be known because it might have led to a nuclear war. But apart from that, it would certainly be known. In fact, endless, much self-righteous denunciation of the hideous crimes. Well, since we're the agent, it's in the memory hole. And there's lessons there. One lesson is that the most important thing that one can do, and the hardest thing, is just to look into the mirror. It's much easier to denounce the other fellow's crimes. It's probably a historical universal, and it's shamefully true of free people in the United States. The atrocities of the 1980s, of course, were not confined to El Salvador. It was much worse in Guatemala. It was pretty bad in Honduras, but nowhere near the other two. When truth commissions were finally established in independent truth commissions, also they attributed almost all the atrocities to the U.S.-run state terrorist forces. One country in the region, Nicaragua, had an army to defend it, so the atrocities were less. In the other countries, the terrorists were the state security forces, and the people were much more defenseless. But even in Nicaragua, the country was ruined. The number of, if you translate the casualties in per capita equivalent terms to the United States, it would be the equivalent of about 2.25 million people killed. That's more than the total of all U.S. deaths in all wars combined since the founding of the country. And this is a poor country which had been making significant progress to escape centuries of violence and oppression for which the U.S. is largely responsible. But that's finished. By now, Nicaragua got worse after the U.S. took it over in 1990. By now, Nicaragua is competing with Guatemala for the prize of second poorest country in the hemisphere. The prize is Haiti, and there's an interesting correlation. Haiti is the prime victim of U.S. intervention in the 20th century, and Nicaragua and Guatemala are competing for second place. And that's actually a correlation that extends much more broadly. It's worth remembering that all of this was done within the framework of what was called a war on terror. A war on terror was declared by the Reagan administration as soon as it came in 1981. Terror was denounced as the plague of the modern age, return to barbarism in our times. We must protect ourselves against it. And they did all over the world. Central America was the prime victim of the defense against terror. Hundreds of thousands dead, 4 countries ruined. It's amazing that they might survive. And it doesn't end when the terror is over. A couple of years ago, a few years after the peace agreements in El Salvador, the Jesuits, the ones who managed to survive, had a conference in which they discussed the consequences of the terror, the residual consequences of the terror, and one of the conclusions of the document, which of course can't be recorded here, is that what's left after years of murder, torture, barbarism, and so on by the state security forces is what they called a culture of terror that domesticates the expectations of the majority of the population and reduces their aspirations, so they're more obedient because they know what the alternative is. And that's the people who have lost hope will just allow the powerful to crush them under their jackboots. That's the idea. Amazingly, many people have not lost hope and continue to struggle, which is another inspiring lesson for us. The analogy to, say, the thought experiment about Czechoslovakia is one that's worth carrying out commonly. You learn a lot by asking what would happen if some official enemy did what we're seeing. So take, for example, 9/11, terrible crime and atrocity. Everyone agrees that it transformed the world. It could have been much worse, of course. It was bad enough, but it could have been much worse. So imagine, say, what it could have been. For example, it could have happened, imagine the following happened. Al-Qaeda succeeded in blowing up, bombing and destroying the White House, killing the president, instituting a brutal military dictatorship, killing right away 50,000 to 100,000 people, something in that range, torturing about 70,000, sending a group that we might call the Kandahar Boys to run the U.S. economy, totally ruining it, creating the most severe economic crisis in U.S. history, destroying, of course, the oldest democracy in the hemisphere, then going back to Kandahar and picking up lots of Nobel Prizes. Meanwhile, also establishing a terrorist organization which not only carried out massive terror in the United States, but also carried out and organized assassinations and massacres throughout the region, supporting military coups and so on and so forth. Well, that would have been a lot worse than 9/11, and certainly would have transformed the world much more than 9/11 did. As most of you know, I'm giving a real example, namely what in Latin America is often called the first 9/11, September 11th, 1973, when all of this happened in Chile. The only thing I've changed is changing the numbers to per capita U.S. equivalents. But that's down the drain too. And it's typical. If those who carry out atrocities and get away with it are also able to put them deep in the memory hole. It's what's called education. These incidents, the Chilean, let's come to the present. Let me read a report from one of the best journals in Central America, an outstanding journal, published by the Jesuit University in Nicaragua, in Rio. They had an article a couple of weeks ago, just came, called Central America Cries, and it's about, I'm reading it, it's about the disasters in El Salvador and Guatemala from the torrential rains, tropical storms in October, which were devastating. They described them as worse even than the 1998 Hurricane Mitch, which was hideous, mostly in Nicaragua. Well, here's what they say. We're seeing now a socially provoked disaster. Once again, our country's vulnerability, the harm done to them by an insensitive, indolent, and irresponsible political class without an ounce of foresight, has been exposed for all to see. The territorial chaos resulting from a lack of planning, deforestation by lumber traffickers, highways cut to serve transnational projects, the construction of commercial areas at the expense of green spaces, the lack of social investment and planning in the areas where the poorest of the poor are squeezed together in unsafe ghettos, and all the other products of the unbridled short-sightedness and voracity of capital, known as neoliberalism and CAFTA, make the consequences of the ravaging winds and rain even more tragic. This is a human disaster in which those with the most power are the most responsible, and those with the least, as always, pay the highest price. It's a social disaster resulting from utter disregard for the lives of the poor and unrestricted regard for money, which turn the essence of the economic model and philosophy of our regions, which form the essence of the economic model and philosophy of our region's dominant groups. And we can add what is most important to us. Those economic dominant groups are those we've imposed in power at the point of a gun with massive terror and violence, all under the rubric of a war on terror. And it goes back long before that. They say it's worse than Hurricane Mitch, which could be, I should say, I have a daughter who lives in Nicaragua for almost 20 years, and after Hurricane Mitch, we tried to get in touch with her, see how terrible it was. She said it was pretty awful, described how horrible it was. But she said if she'd been living in Seattle, it would have been a heavy rainstorm. And that's correct. In a country that's destroyed by foreign power, it's a total disaster. Envio reported on Hurricane Mitch. They asked, is it an act of God? And they said, no, it's not an act of God. It's not a natural disaster. It's a neoliberal disaster, which was correct. And as the most striking symbol of it, they brought up what was in fact a horrible catastrophe. You may remember the Pozaltega volcano, where hundreds of people died buried in a mudslide. The poor peasants had been driven up to try to find a place to live, cut down what trees there were to survive. When the heavy rains came, mudslide, hundreds killed, buried in it. Right next door, a couple of miles away, it was a benefit to the agribusiness plantations, which had the valuable land and improved their produce and did just fine. Ordinary neoliberal disaster. Hurricane Mitch also had a side effect. It exposed tens of thousands of landmines that had been left there by the US-run terrorist forces that invaded Nicaragua, and that causes another great danger that people walk on them and so on. Fortunately, a demining group was sent from France, not from the United States. And since we live in a free country, all of this was reported, namely in Peacework, the pacifist newspaper. So everybody knows about it. Well, that's neoliberal disasters. And the current one, the horrible disasters in Guatemala and El Salvador a couple of weeks ago, are simply another. Chile has the hideous disaster in Chile, which also persists, also had a background. In fact, its immediate background started around in 1962. It's not the beginning of U.S. atrocities in Central America by a long shot, but there was a change in 1962, a significant change, and the hemisphere changed as a result of it. In 1962, John F. Kennedy effectively shifted the mission of the Latin American military from what was called hemispheric defense, kind of a leftover from the Second World War, shifted it from hemispheric defense to internal security. Internal security is a technical term which means war against the population. That set off a massive plague of repression throughout the hemisphere, starting right away in 1962. Same year, Kennedy sent a special forces mission to Colombia, first major intervention in Colombia. The Special Forces mission advised the government to undertake what General Yarborough, who headed it, called paramilitary terror. And the training manuals were devised to do it, and it's right on the front pages now. Paramilitary terror has turned, which is so closely linked to the military that you can't distinguish them. Human Rights Watch calls the paramilitaries the 6th division of the Colombian army, in addition to the 5 official divisions. Just a couple of weeks ago, high officials of the Colombian intelligence services were forced to resign because it was exposed that they had overt ties with the paramilitaries, although the ties are barely hidden. And it has turned Colombia into the worst human rights catastrophe in the hemisphere in the 1990s. It wasn't in the 1980s because there were worse ones going on in Central America. But by the 1980s, it became the worst human rights catastrophe and also the highest recipient of U.S. military aid. It replaced El Salvador as the leading recipient of U.S. military aid in the world. That's aside from Israel and Egypt, which are a separate category. Colombia, first Turkey, where there were monstrous atrocities going on, and Colombia became the leading recipient of U.S. military aid. That also happens to be a correlation, very broad and well established in scholarship, not taught in your usual high school, where it ought to be taught. Colombia was the first. Shortly after that, the Kennedy administration prepared the ground for a military coup in Brazil, where there was a mildly populist president they wanted to get rid of. The coup actually took place a couple of weeks after the assassination, established the first national security state, neo-Nazi style national security state in Latin America. It was welcomed by U.S. liberals, the U.S. ambassador, as the greatest step forward in democracy in the mid-20th century and so on. You all know what it was like. I won't describe it. Brazil is a big country. That had an effect on others. There's a domino effect. One of the consequences was Chile a couple of years later. Then came others. Argentina was the worst of them all, and then spread to Central America under the framework of the war against terror. One of the main targets was, in fact, the church. It's more than symbolic that the decade began with the murder of an archbishop saying Mass, a voice for the voiceless, and ended with the murder of 6 leading intellectuals, Jesuits, priests. The church became an enemy, in fact, a serious enemy of the United States in the 1970s and the 1980s, because it had committed a grave sin. It had adopted the preferential option for the poor, going back to what the church had been in its first 3 centuries before Constantine turned it into the Church of the Rich. And that's a terrible crime, had to be punished by slaughter and massacre and so on. The idea of priests and nuns and lay workers going to organize peasants and actually read the Gospels and see what it says, I mean, that's an intolerable crime. The Vatican cooperated by kicking out the offending priests, silencing them. The United States just had them murdered. And they take pride in it. It's not hidden. So the School of the Americas has what are called talking points. It's advertising what it's proud of. Here's what we do really well. One of its talking points is literally that the U.S. Army helped defeat liberation theology. which is quite true. That's what was should have been commemorated yesterday, and at the time of the 25th anniversary of the assassination of the Archbishop and much else. The major victims, however, were the usual ones, those I mentioned: working people, peasants, human rights activists, union leaders, and so on. And yes, that more or less it crushed liberation theology and a lot of the progress that was beginning to be made in the late 70s and the early 80s after escaping from centuries of repression. And it's now back to substantial misery again, and the current programs are designed to make it worse by enhancing the kinds of situation that NVO accurately described under the framework of CAFTA and other such agreements, which are designed for the interests of those who create them, not surprisingly, and it's not poor peasants and workers. After the second 9/11, as we ought to call it, the one on September 11th, 2001, after the second 9/11, focus of attention shifted to the Middle East. Latin America is sort of off the radar screen, but not for Washington planners of grand strategy. They're paying very close attention, and some illustrations are just given figures. So by now, military and police assistance to Latin America is greater than all total of social and economic aid. That's new. That never happened during the Cold War. During the Cold War, the height of the Cold War, social and economic aid far exceeded military aid. It's been reversed. The year 2002 to 2003, last figures available, Latin American troops trained by U.S. programs rose 50%. That's military and police, and the police are more or less military. They're now being trained in light infantry tactics. SOUTHCOM, that's the Southern Command, U.S. Southern Command, which runs the region, now has more personnel in Latin America than most key civilian federal agencies combined. Totally new. And they have a new focus. Their new focus is on what's called radical populism and street gangs. As you just heard, and you know, the street gangs are one of our exports to Latin America. Radical populism is the old problem, people trying to take their own fate into their own hands. That's now the focus of the greatly enhanced U.S.-run military efforts. There's also been a shift in military training. It had been under the State Department officially. Now it's been shifted to the Pentagon. That has an advantage. Under the State Department, at least in principle, military training had to meet certain human rights conditionalities, which had weak supervision, but some supervision by Congress. That's gone when it shifts to the Pentagon. So it's very much on the radar screen, and for good reasons. There's a lot of concern about Latin America. The region from Venezuela down to Argentina is getting completely out of control, and Central America, the lid is barely on. From Venezuela down to Argentina, there are left-leaning governments all the way through. That's not the way formal democracy is supposed to work. One of them, Argentina, defied the IMF, which is really bad behavior, and actually improved the economy as a result, not surprisingly. There are indigenous movements which are significant and militant. They're spreading all throughout the region, Bolivia to Ecuador. And those are regions of resources, primarily energy exports. And the indigenous populations, they want their own indigenous nation, and they're not particularly interested in having their lands and societies ruined so that people can drive SUVs in Boston. So they want to cut back on the oil exports to the United States. The worst problem of all, of course, is Venezuela. But much more generally, the whole region is increasing its trade relations with the European Union, and particularly with China. It's going far up. There's rough spots, but it's going to increase. And in particular, the raw material exporters, like Brazil and Chile, which economy largely relies on copper exports from, incidentally, a highly efficient nationalized copper industry, which the Chicago boys were unable to dismantle. That's increasing. The highest trade with China, and it's going up, is Venezuela. It's part of Venezuela's effort to diversify its exports, and Venezuela has enormous energy resources, as you know. Getting worse than that, Venezuela and Cuba are entering into close and very natural relations. There's a barter system between Venezuela and Cuba in which each is relying on its strength. So Venezuela is providing low-cost oil, and Cuba is providing tens of thousands, actually, of doctors and teachers who go out into places where the Venezuelan professional elites just won't go, rural areas, poor slums, and so on. That's causing all sorts of fury. Worse still, there's Venezuela and Cuba are now engaged in a project called Operation Miracle in the Caribbean, in which, with Venezuelan funding, Cuban medical specialists go to countries like Jamaica and try to find people who can be treated with Cuba's advanced medical facilities. Right now they're concentrating on blindness. So they're finding people who are actually blind, can't see, but who can be surgically cured, bringing them to Cuba, and they're going back to, say, Jamaica, able to see. Well, you know, it has very bad effects on the population, as you can imagine. And that's a problem, and what's more, it may even extend to Boston. I just learned that there's a Boston-Venezuela agreement in the offing. It'll become public in a couple of weeks, in which Venezuela will provide low-cost oil to poor people in Boston who are going to have a hard time this winter. Now, that may also have rather negative effects, which are hard to stop. Mercosur, the southern cone economic area, is expanding. Venezuela may join it. It provides an alternative to the U.S.-run FTAA. Press describes the conflict as Bush's vision of free trade and democracy versus Chavez's anti-Americanism. Another embarrassment to the free trade, to the free press. The free trade has very little to do with free trade. It just takes even the most casual look at the agreements to see that. And democracy we can forget about. At issue is just alternative social and economic models. Are you going to have economic integration oriented to the needs of investors or oriented to the needs of the population? The one that's oriented to the needs of investors is called globalization. The one that's oriented to the needs of people is called anti-globalization. But that's the usual success of the rich and powerful in turning terms into their opposite for propaganda purposes, kind of like terror. Terror doesn't mean terror, it means the terror that they carry out against us. The terror that we carry out against them, which is often far worse, as in Central America, that's defense against terror. That's normal. Same with globalization. Well, the U.S. is deeply concerned about all this, for obvious reasons. In 2002, Washington embraced Bush's vision of democracy by supporting a military coup in Venezuela, which very briefly overturned the government, welcomed by the United States, the groups involved in it had been funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, makes sense in the world of Orwell. The Bush administration had to back down from its enthusiastic support for the military coup because of the overwhelming opposition to it in Latin America, where they have the odd idea that democracy doesn't include military coups to overthrow elected governments. And besides, the military coup was quickly overthrown by popular resistance. Nevertheless, didn't stop. After having failed to carry out a military coup, Washington is now engaged in an effort at subversion. And it's not secret. The subversion is carried out primarily through the National Endowment for Democracy, namely the group that supported those who carried out the coup. And it's the support, well, it's described in the press as support for anti-Chavez pro-democracy forces. Notice it's true by definition that if you're pro-democracy, you're anti-Chavez. The reason is because the U.S. is against Chavez, so it therefore follows, as night follows day, that the way to be pro-democracy is to oppose Chavez. Well, there is, we might ask what would happen, say, if Iran had supported a military coup in the United States and was forced to back down because of opposition in the Middle East, and then immediately turned to subversion in the United States by supporting pro-democracy anti-Bush groups, let's say. I mean, would some eyebrows be raised? Maybe worse. There are some people who actually might have something to say about Venezuelan democracy, namely Venezuelans, but backward people, so it doesn't matter much. Anyway, just for curiosity, they do say some things. Chavez's popularity has now reached about 80%. Venezuela leads all of Latin America, in fact, well ahead of the United States, in support for the elected government, and the support has been going up sharply during Chavez's years. And it's not a big secret why. You can read about it in the independent press, like, say, the Irish Times, leading journal in Ireland, where one of the major Latin American correspondents, well respected and known for decades, Noam Chomsky, has a long discussion coming back from Venezuela, and he points out the obvious. It's the first time in Venezuela's history, and it's an extremely rich country in principle, it's the first time in its history that the government has done anything for the mass of the population, the overwhelming mass of the population, who live in miserable poverty right next to incredible wealth, the neoliberal ideal. And now something's being done for them, so amazingly he's popular. But that's anti-democratic because we say so. El Salvador also poses problems. They had an election in March 2004, and it looked like the wrong people were going to win. So pursuing the fabled vision of democracy, the Bush administration sent its hitmen to announce that if El Salvadorans were foolish enough to vote the wrong way, the United States might cut off remittances, which is what the economy survives on. Poor Salvadoran workers who cut the lawns, take care of, clean the house, and so on, and send back remittances, which is one of the main bases of the economy. So that gets cut off if you vote the wrong way, and then you can have a free election, which can be applauded here as a triumph of democracy. That's rather typical. Well, the U.S. has one ally left in the Western Hemisphere. That's Canada, or was. Right now, U.S.-Canadian relations are probably at the lowest point they've ever been. The reason is because there was a dispute, trade dispute, which went to NAFTA, the NAFTA board, and it ruled against the United States. So the United States just told it to get lost. And the Canadians weren't very happy about it. In fact, they're pretty upset. And the Minister of Resources, in fact, just announced that Canada may shift its oil exports to the United States, shift a substantial part of them, he said about a quarter, to China, which could increase. Canada is the second biggest oil producer in the Western Hemisphere after Venezuela, so that would be two of them gone. It takes real talent to be able to alienate Canada. Other countries it's kind of easy. So you really have to give these guys some credit. If you look back at U.S. intelligence projections, National Intelligence Council projections for the coming couple of decades, they, of course, insisted that the U.S. must control the oil of the Middle East. That's the main energy source, and you have to control it. But they expected that, and then proposed that the U.S. should itself rely on more stable Atlantic basin resources. That means West Africa and the Western Hemisphere, but those are tottering. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was an Ibero-American conference held in Spain, Salamanca, barely noticed here, but rather important. There had been something sort of formal like that, but that was a serious one. The Latin American countries in Spain, they passed they produced a declaration which had two major points. One was opposition to the blockade, as it was called, against Cuba. The second was a demand that Luis Posada Carrilles, one of the most notorious international terrorists in the world, be extradited from the United States, where he's now asking for asylum, extradited back to Venezuela, where he's wanted for his role in the blowing up of the Cubana airliner, which killed 73 people. An immigration judge just turned that down, but the Ibero-American Conference didn't particularly like that. So that was the second major demand. The U.S. was infuriated and put a lot of pressure on Spain to try to get them to withdraw those two provisions. They finally agreed to withdraw the one about Posada under tremendous pressure, but they wouldn't withdraw the one about Cuba, arguing that they were in the mainstream of world opinion. And if you read the newspapers really carefully, you would have found that there were about, I think, 150 words in the New York Times. I don't remember if there's anything in the Globe, reporting a couple of weeks ago that the United Nations once again had a vote on the blockade against Cuba. This time, the opposition reached its highest level yet, 182. The vote was 182 to 4. The 4 were the United States and Israel, which reflexively has to go along, though it violates the blockade. So Israel, the United States, the Marshall Islands, and Palau. And there was an abstention, to be accurate. Micronesia abstained. So it's a really divided vote. And on the basis of that, the Ibero-American Conference said they'd keep to that one. There is a much broader framework of all of this. Let's go back to the Middle East. Take Iraq. I'm not going to spend time discussing the incredible catastrophe that's been created there. You know about it. But it's worth remembering a few things. The U.S. and British governments went to war in Iraq because of what was called a single question. Bush, Blair, Powell, Rice, Jack Straw kept emphasizing the single question. Will Saddam Hussein give up his weapons of mass destruction? That was the basis for the authorization for the use of force in Congress. That was the mode of terrifying the population in the United States off the international spectrum. So the U.S. became the only country in the world which not only hated Saddam Hussein, but was literally afraid of him. Unlike, say, Kuwait and Iran, which he invaded, and they hated him, they weren't afraid, they knew he was the weakest country in the region. But here people were afraid. Congress gave its authorization because of the single question. Well, the single question was answered within a couple of months. It was answered the wrong way, and all of a sudden a miraculous transformation took place. It turned out that the reason for invading Iraq wasn't the single question. It was what the Boston Globe calls Bush's messianic mission to bring democracy to Iraq and the Middle East. And very quickly, that became invariant. I mean, I've been looking really hard for the last couple of years to see if I can find anything in the media you can forget about, but in scholarship even, which doesn't say the Bush administration is guided by Bush's vision or his messianic mission to bring democracy. And that's kind of the first sentence of every scholarly article on the Bush doctrine. It's the media, with impressive discipline. You might expect it in North Korea. When a dear leader says something, it's just true. But it's much more interesting when it happens in a free country where people are doing it at will, not at the point of a gun. That really is impressive and a sign that the educational system is working very well. People know how to behave. So anyhow, the mission became Bush's messianic mission. The mission was declared formally at, naturally, the National Endowment of Democracy anniversary meeting, November 2003, and instantly there was enormous praise in the Washington Post and elsewhere that for this war, which was, as the Post called it, the most noble war in history, and on, selflessly pursuing a messianic mission. I work hard to find an exception to that. There are some exceptions, I have to admit. A couple of days after the messianic mission was formally pronounced, there was a poll released, Gallup poll in Baghdad, which was actually reported, a small report in the Washington Post, where people were asked to jump on the bandwagon, give their opinion as to why the U.S. invaded Iraq. And there were some who agreed with approximately 100% of educated opinion in the West. 1%. 1% said the goal was to bring democracy to Iraq. 5% said the goal was to help Iraqis. And most of the rest took the position that's derided here as a conspiracy theory, which you can't even mention, it's so disgraceful. They said, well, it was to take control of Iraq's oil and to serve the U.S. interests in organizing the Middle East and Israeli interests in remaining dominant. We're not supposed to believe that. We're well educated. So we therefore know that the U.S. would have liberated Iraq, even if its main product was, say, pickles and lettuce. That had nothing to do with it. Anything else is a conspiracy theory, or Marxist or anti-American or something else. But Iraqis somehow backward and not well educated. In fact, the whole democracy mission is a very hard sell in the Middle East, just as it would be in Latin America if anybody dared to try it, for pretty much the same reasons. You surely read a couple of weeks ago about the tour that Karen Hughes made, Bush administration PR person, made a tour through the Middle East. This was the tour where she started every talk by, "I'm a mom, I love children," and the rest of the speech was to show that you really don't understand us. We really are here to help you. We don't care about your oil or any of that stuff. We're here to help you, and we're going to help you bring democracy and progress and forget everything that's happened for the last 50 years. I mean, that's just ancient history, or it didn't happen. And the tour didn't go so well. In fact, it went very badly. And it was interesting to see how it was reported. The chief diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, Stephen Weissman, followed her on the tour, and he reported it accurately. He said it turned out badly, and the reason was that Hughes was keeping to concise sound bites and avoiding sustained argument. And Weissman said, well, that works pretty well in the United States. The president produces the sound bites, the media amplify them, and then there's a ton of advertising that entrenches them. And that works, because we have real democracy. But in the Middle East, he said, with what he called its lively and percussive atmosphere, that doesn't seem to work. They don't want sound bites, and they want sustained argument. So we're going to have a hard time in democracy promotion. It's obvious among these backward people. That was demonstrated a couple of weeks later when there was a debate in Beirut, which happens to be unusually lively and percussive, center of debate and discussion and so on for decades back. The U.S. Information officer in the embassy took one side of the debate, defending democracy promotion. The other side was taken actually by a U.S. aid official who was a mild critic of it. This is Lebanon, not the United States, so it was reported ironically in the mainstream press. And they said the problem, they just mocked it. They said the problem was that the U.S. information officer opened by saying, with a PowerPoint demonstration of what you call the 4 E's. I forget what the 4 E's were, but we make them up. Here's E number 1, 2, 3, 4. This wonderful we are. I love children. I'm a mom, and so on. And it just didn't play. It just didn't play in Beirut. It's a long way to go. Well, the big problem, aside from Iraq, which really they've gotten themselves into a hideous mess in Iraq, is forgetting what it's doing to Iraqis. The other main problem is Iran. And Iran does have options. If Iran decides that the European Union is so much, so deeply subordinated to the United States that it's going to do whatever Washington commands, Iran has an option, and it's known what it is. It can turn to the east. There is an Asian, it's called an Asian energy security grid. It's formed basically by China and Russia, but India will probably come in. There's also a Shanghai Cooperation Organization, same basis. Shanghai Cooperation Organization is aimed primarily at Central Asia, and it's moving towards setting up a kind of an alternative to NATO. The energy security grid is seeking energy independence, so they won't be under the thumb of the United States. Iran, if it joins it, can be a kind of a linchpin. They have a lot of oil, a huge amount of natural gas. That could be, and then it becomes more serious. There's a lot of people who propose withdrawal strategies for Iraq, which, as if the Pentagon couldn't think of them. I mean, my 10-year-old daughter could think of them. They're very obvious. So they can think of them, they just don't want to exercise them. And there's a pretty good reason for it. It's very hard to see how the U.S. can agree to pull out of Iraq. If Iraq, and leave it, unless it's left as a subservient client state of the traditional Latin American type in the old days. If Iraq has any degree of sovereignty and a limited degree of democracy, if that happens, just imagine the policies it'll follow. I mean, first of all, it'll have a Shiite majority. If it splits, then there'll be a federal system. There'll be a Shiite autonomous region in the south, which happens to be where most of the oil is. The Shiite population has very close ties to Iran. The Badr Brigade, which has recently been implicated in the tortures and that you've been reading about the last few days, and pretty much runs the south. It's a pretty brutal bunch. They were trained in Iran. High percentage of the clerics, I think around 90%, including Ayatollah Sistani, come from Iran. And even those who don't like Iran or may hate them would rather have friendly relations with a powerful nature than hostile ones. In fact, relations are intensifying in military, economic, and other. And then you could naturally move towards a Shiite Iraqi-Iranian alliance. Furthermore, right across the border in Saudi Arabia, there's a largely Shiite population. And as this continues in Iraq, if there's any semblance of democracy and sovereignty, the Shiite population, which is bitterly repressed by the US-backed tyranny, is going to continue, as it has tried in the past and been crushed, it's going to continue to seek more autonomy. So you are moving towards the ultimate nightmare. The world's major, that happens to be where the oil is, okay? Here's the major oil resources in the world in the hands of an independent alliance. It's not following US orders. And if Iran does turn to the east, they may too. So you have all the major reserves of energy in the world moving towards the Asian energy security grid and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I mean, it's hard to imagine how Washington can tolerate this. This would lead to nuclear war. I don't know what it would lead to. Of course, it depends on us whether they'll allow independence and sovereignty, and it would be best for the world if they did, but it doesn't mean it's going to happen. Anyhow, that's the ultimate nightmare. It's not that far away. I mean, the catastrophe that they've created in Iraq is expediting it. Combined with comparable things happening here, which I described, it's a very serious problem for them. Quite on top of that, the Bush administration, radical nationalists, not conservatives, have severely weakened the United States in every respect except one. They have increased military force. So the U.S. now spends approximately the same amount as the rest of the world in military expenditures and very advanced, highly lethal and destructive measures. That looks like a power, but it isn't. It's a serious danger. Simply take a look at the strategic analysis literature, very mainstream, very conservative and respected, which points out that the Rumsfeld transformation of the military, I'm quoting, carries an appreciable risk of ultimate doom, and it may not be that far off, and the reasons are understood. It compels rivals, potential rivals and targets, to react naturally, and Russian offensive military capacity aimed at the U.S. has increased very sharply in the last few years. China's is now beginning to increase. You can read about it in this morning's papers. Now they're beginning to develop an advanced offensive military power for the first time, and of course they will. That's the immediate consequence of threatening to destroy them, which is what aggressive militarism does. If the U.S. moves on to militarization of space, which the rest of the world unanimously, except for Israel, has been trying to block for years, I mean, that's, like a kiss of death. I mean, everyone knows that what's called missile defense is an offensive first strike weapon, and the way to react to it is by creating a deterrent. Deterrent could be increased terror, or it could be nuclear-armed ICBMs aimed at the United States to destroy it. That's a deterrent. In fact, the invasion of Iraq taught a very clear lesson to countries like Iran and North Korea and any other potential target. Said, you want to keep yourself from being invaded by this monster, you better have a deterrent. Couldn't be clearer. Every strategic analyst in the world knows it. Very recently, one of Israel's leading military historians and analysts, Martin von Crefeld, wrote that, of course, he hopes Iran doesn't develop nuclear weapons, and he doesn't know if they're trying to, but he says if they're not trying to, they're crazy, because you have to. The United States is forcing them to. So the one thing that looks like increasing strength is in fact increasing the danger of survival in this case. We're talking about survival of the species, not just danger to the United States. In addition, uncontroversially, the Bush administration policies, in particular the war in Iraq, but a lot more, have sharply increased fear of the United States, often hatred of the United States. They have undoubtedly increased terror. It's confirmed by the U.S. and other intelligence agencies. We just saw it a couple of days ago in Jordan. Yes, it was anticipated that the invasion of Iraq would increase terror and proliferation, and that's exactly what happened. They're domestically moving towards a serious fiscal crisis. The economy, the U.S. has gone through about 25 years of the worst period of its economic history. Alan Greenspan is being now applauded as St. Alan for having supervised the marvelous economy, and it is marvelous for a small percentage of people sort of top of the income level. But this is the first time in American history that except for deep depression, in which for a majority of the population for 25 years now, real wages have stagnated or declined. You go back to 25 years ago, the U.S., as you'd expect in the richest country in the world, had about the highest wages and the lowest working hours, reversed. Now has in the industrial world close to the lowest wages and the highest working hours. Benefits are declining. It's getting worse every day. The bill that's being debated in Congress today is going to make it worse. Well, that's hard problems, aside from the fiscal crisis that's being created, which they all know about. Just a couple of days ago, the IMF urged the United States to raise taxes to avoid a meltdown of the global economic system. Well, if it's the United States, they urge. If it's somebody else, they order. The United States ultimately get lost, as usual, because these people really don't care whether there'll be a world for their grandchildren to live in, let's say. What's necessary is to stuff the pockets of the rich with plenty of dollars to enhance your power, and somebody else will worry about the rest. Well, that's an ugly development, not just for us, but for the world. But there are hopeful signs. and it's worth remembering them. One hopeful sign is, in fact, why we're here, the development of the solidarity movement in the 1980s. This was maybe the first, or certainly one of the first. But that's something totally new in the history of Western imperialism. There had never been solidarity movements. There was no solidarity movement with the people of South Vietnam. There were no people going down to South Vietnam to live in villages and try to help people, or maybe a white face will protect them. And remember, South Vietnam was the main target of the American attack from 1962 when Kennedy invaded. Nothing like that. There was no solidarity movements in Algeria, or just pick it, any kind. It's never happened. But it did happen in the 1980s on quite a massive scale, in fact. It's a major breakthrough. We're talking about El Salvador, but it was all over Central America. It affects now all over the world. There's an international solidarity movement, which is, it's not huge, but it's everywhere. It's never happened before. It reflects big changes that have taken place inside the United States. In many ways, it's become a lot more civilized, and it's a very hopeful sign for the future. Another hopeful sign is the enormous gap between public opinion and public policy. I don't have time to review it, but it's very striking. It's almost never reported in the press for good reasons. You don't want people to know that they are right that their opinion is right in the mainstream. You want them to think I'm a lunatic and nobody else could believe this. So it's simply not reported. Dramatic. If I had time, I'd talk about it. But this is a tremendous gap between public opinion and public policy on issue after issue. It's not just a gap. What it shows is that both political parties are well to the right of the population on major issues, domestic and international. That makes the country an organizer's dream. It's a free country. We're not going to get our brains blown out by the Atlácatl brigade. There's a lot that you can do about it. It's really a matter of will at this point. I'll just finish by going back to Envío on the article that I was reading from before called Central America Cries. They end by saying, this is the Jesuit University, we sit down to cry for you, Central America, on the shores of Lake Atitlan, one of Central America's most fascinating sights, whose beauty is so intense it hurts, and also one of the worst and most painful points of this tragedy, one they describe. And we pledge to dry those tears so we can continue fighting with ideas and with words to make our nations and societies more nature-friendly, more socially just, and more humanly happy. It's up to us to see that those dreams can be realized.